Post-colonial poetry originates from post-colonial literature, which comes from the colonies that were once ruled by Britain. The time in which post-colonial poetry was popular was both after the colonial ruled colonies like the Caribbean, Africa, and India, and slightly before the end of their ruling. That being said, in order for a poem to be considered post-colonial, the author must have been from a colonized country.
Some of the poetic characteristics of post-colonial poetry involve characteristics of mood, imagery, theme, and verse. Many poems about the post-colonial era include tones and moods of anger and sadness for what they've gone through during colonization. Other poems from this era include moods of happiness, satisfaction, and hope for what they've endured and survived. As well as imagery, they provide a lot of imagery shown throughout the literature to capture the senses such as smells, sounds, and visual aspects of colonization. There also is a lot of theme of freedom, resistance, and cultural diversity within post-colonial literature. These themes counteract the colonial views they were taught in colonization process from Britain and other empires, as well as free verse is used in many works of post-colonial literature to detail the newly renounced freedom obtained by cultures within society. This poem captures a lot of those characteristics. Talk to me instead of the culture generally, how the murderers were sustained, by the beauty robbed by savages to our remote villages the painters came, and our whitewashed mud huts were splattered with gunfire. And then this is from, I can't pronounce that, but that's from his book, Don't Talk to Me About Matisse. And looking at this poem from the post-colonial era, you can see the characteristics of anger displayed by the writer because of the change in conflict they personally felt during those times of colonization. The imagery shown within the poem captures the rage and resentment felt against colonizers. I chose this poem specifically because it shows the emotions clearly and helps the reader understand what his culture went through to achieve freedom.
Chinua Achebe was a Nigerian novelist, poet, professor, and critic. During his time as a teacher, he became increasingly involved in the literary and cultural renaissance that was spreading across Nigeria in the wake of colonialism. His novel, Things Fall Apart, that was published in 1958, earned him international acclaim and solidified his reputation as a leading voice in African literature. Following this success, Achebe continued to write novels, essays, and poetry, often addressing themes related to African identity, politics, and social change. While Chinua Achebe is perhaps best known for his novels, his impact on poetry is also significant. In his poetry, Achebe used rich imagery and symbolism to bring up the complexities of African society and history. He often drew on Igbo oral traditions and folklore, infusing his verse with a sense of rhythm and storytelling that would resonate with readers. Achebe's poems also reflect his concern with the impact of colonization on African communities while advocating for cultural pride and resilience. One of Achebe's notable poetry collections is Beware, Soul Brother, and Other Poems, published in 1971. This collection showcases his skillful use of language and his ability to convey ideas in short and powerful verse. In poems such as Refugee Mother and Child and A Mother in a Refugee Camp, Achebe explores the human cost of conflict and displacement, offering emotional reflections on loss, survival, and compassion. Another notable poet to look at is Derek Walcott. Derek Walcott was a celebrated poet, playwright, and essayist, known for his richly evocative works that explored themes of identity, cultural heritage, and the complexities of Caribbean life. Walcott had a diverse education reflecting both the British colonial legacy and the local Caribbean culture. Throughout his career, Walcott was awarded numerous prestigious honors and awards, including the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1992, making him the first Caribbean writer to receive this recognition. His work was celebrated for its lyrical beauty, linguistical inventiveness, and profound exploration of universal themes. His talent as a poet began to emerge during his formative years, and he published his first poem at the age of 14. His early poetry collections, such as 25 Poems and Epitaph for the Young, the seventh cantos, garnered critical attention and established him as a promising young voice in Caribbean literature.
The following poetry analyses that I chose are by Natalie Diaz. She is a poet who has just written beautifully about post-colonial love. Post-colonial poetry vividly expresses the emotions and sentiments that poets and society experience in response to colonization. Unlike the later Beat generation, post-colonial literature values the freedom of expression in its writing. Post-colonial love poetry particularly explores feelings and cultural details, wavering personal stories with historical influences. Focusing on love, these poems dive into questions of identity, resilience, and how colonial history shapes our connections. An example is, in fact, the poet I chose, Natalie Diaz, who adds her unique voice to this exploration, contributing to a rich tapestry of emotions and cultural intricacies within post-colonial love poetry. In particular, the second poem broadens the themes, shedding light on the history and struggles of marginalized communities, especially Indigenous people. Diaz's perspective emphasizes the lasting effects of history and culture on personal experiences, highlighting the continuous search for acceptance and love in a society filled with complex relationships and contradictions.
Comparative study. The comparison between the Beats poets and language poets were a big part of post-colonial poetry. Both notable groups shared the love and expression of writing. With the difficulties and struggles in life, all these poets were able to tie their own experiences into their writing, creating descriptive poetic stories. Both literary groups shared an aspect of having a large number of members in their poetry groups. These groups shared a starting location of New York, one of the cities that they started in. The differences. The Beats poets originated in New York around the 1940s. They were materialistic thinkers and free-flowing writers when it came to poetry. This specific materialistic group influenced the hippie generation later on in the late 60s. The language poets picked up in their group later on into the 1960s. Where the Beats poets found inspiration in jazz, haikus, and being surrealists, the language poets strictly found inspiration in specific poets. William Carlos William and Gertrude Stein struck many of the poets as inspirational. The language poets structured their writing around a deconstructionism point of view. The significance of the language poets was their use of free writing. Their poetic writing is purposely difficult to read, not non-transparent, and made to be thought about deeply. The language poets purposely expressed political viewpoints and recognition towards specific topics in their writing.
This is a poetry analysis on the poem titled On Being Brought from Africa to America by Phillis Wheatley. This poem was written from a first-person point of view, with Phillis Wheatley herself being the speaker, and the poem took place after Wheatley was enslaved in America. And the conflict of this poem is the racism she speaks of in lines 5 and 6, and possibly the controversy behind her expressing her thankfulness to being shown Christianity upon coming to America. And the tone can be described as almost informative, as Wheatley informs the reader through describing her situation being taken from her homeland, and simply states how colored people are treated through a quote and description throughout the poem. Along with that, the author's tone is calm for the most part, and she also ends the poem suggesting all races are invited to heaven. That final line also suggests Wheatley expressing a little hope overall. The poem is not negative, it is more positive and informing. And the title of this poem is also informative as it accurately describes what is to follow. In the poem, Wheatley describes her unique experiences and thoughts surrounding her situation. She expresses her opinion and stance on religion and seems to be thankful for being introduced to Christianity upon her arrival. She describes how some view her race and even quotes presumably what has been said about people of color at the time, and just basically shows the hate being spread. Towards the end of the poem, she reminds people that even people of color are invited on the angelic train, therefore trying to bring her belief in God into the divide between races and encourage readers to share her opinion. And the author's reasoning for writing this poem is to both share her unique view on the situation, but also encourage others to be less hateful. We can see this through the last two lines of the poem.
In conclusion, post-colonial poetry vividly expresses the emotions and sentiments that poets and society experience in response to colonization. Unlike the later Beat generation, post-colonial literature values the freedom of expression in its writing. Post-colonial love poetry particularly weaves together personal stories and historical influences to explore identity, resilience, and the enduring effects of colonial histories on relationships. These poems narrate personal experiences and highlight how history shapes our understanding of ourselves and our connections with others.